A small roadside diner, the flickering neon lights reflecting off the rows of motorcycles parked out front. Inside, the air hung thick with the boisterous laughter of a rowdy biker gang. They were used to ruling the roost until a man walked in, quiet and unassuming. His demeanor was calm, his gait slow, but beneath it all lurked a silent menace. They saw a lone old man. Little did they know they were provoking a legend. What happens when bullies pick on the wrong target? Before we dive into this tale, let us know where you're watching from. Share your city or country in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. Tomorrow, we'll bring you another inspiring story, tailored just for you. The story begins. The diner perched precariously on the edge of a desolate highway, surrounded by miles of barren land and withered cacti. The old neon sign flickered erratically, casting a pallid light on the fading twilight. Inside, the air was thick with the aroma of frying bacon and freshly brewed coffee. Regulars filled the worn booths, their voices blending into a low hum of conversation. A waitress in a checkered apron weaved deftly between the tables, balancing plates of burgers and fries. It was the kind of place where nothing extraordinary ever happened, until Clint Eastwood walked in. The door creaked open, letting in a gust of warm Texas air, along with a man who seemed both out of place and perfectly at home. Clint's presence was imposing, his broad shoulders and tall frame hinting at a life well lived. The deep lines etched on his face spoke of countless battles fought, some physical, some mental. He wore a leather jacket that looked like it had seen decades of wear and a hat that shadowed his sharp, wary eyes. The hum of conversation died down, all eyes turning to him, a mix of curiosity and unease spreading across the diner. Clint scanned the room before making his way to an empty booth near the window. His movements were slow, deliberate, each step measured. He was a man who never rushed, who weighed every action. He slid into the booth and nodded to the waitress as she approached. "Black coffee and scrambled eggs," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. The waitress, Rose, offered a warm smile. "Coming right up." Across the room, the tranquil atmosphere was shattered by the raucous laughter of a biker gang sprawled across two adjacent booths. Their presence dominated the diner, their leather vests adorned with skull and flame patches, marking them as members of the Iron Serpent Motorcycle Club. The leader of the pack, a burly man named Rex, held court, regaling his cronies with crude jokes that sent them into fits of laughter. His voice was coarse and laced with a hint of menace, the kind that made people think twice before crossing him. Rex's eyes landed on Clint, and a malicious grin spread across his face. "Well, looky here, we got ourselves a cowboy," he boomed, ensuring the entire diner could hear. His lackeys snickered, their eyes darting between Rex and Clint. But Clint remained, unfazed. He took a sip of his coffee, his gaze fixed on the scenery outside the window as if Rex didn't exist. The bikers weren't used to being ignored, and Rex wasn't one to pass up an opportunity to intimidate. "Hey, old-timer," Rex taunted, his tone dripping with mockery. "Did you lose your horse on the way here?" Laughter erupted from his cronies, but Clint remained silent, his expression an impassive mask. The other diners shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing the brewing trouble. Rose, ever the peacemaker, shot Rex a warning glance, but he shrugged it off. Clint finally set his coffee cup down, the clink of ceramic against the table sounding exceptionally loud in the sudden silence. The small diner was quiet. He slowly turned his head, his sharp eyes locking onto Rex for a moment. The whole room seemed to hold its breath. "Mind your own business," Clint said, his voice even but carrying an unmistakable edge of authority. Rex's smirk faltered, if only for a split second, before he regained his composure. "Well, we got a tough one here," he sneered. "What are you going to do about it, old man?" The tension in the room had reached a fever pitch, like a powder keg waiting for a spark. Clint's calm demeanor was unnerving, a stark contrast to Rex's loud bravado and his gang's bluster. At this point, Clint returned to his coffee, but there was an unspoken understanding in the air that this confrontation was far from over. The tension from Rex's taunts hung heavy, thick and suffocating. Clint remained still, his focus seemingly on the wisps of steam curling from his black coffee. But his composure only seemed to further agitate Rex. The rest of the diner was unusually quiet, the other patrons feigning interest in their meals while stealing glances at the unfolding standoff. Rose, the waitress, stood nervously behind the counter, her eyes darting between Clint and the bikers. "Hey, cowboy," Rex called again, his voice now louder, laced with derision. "Are you deaf? Or just too old to hear me?" His cronies chuckled, egging him on. One of them, a gaunt man with a scar running down his cheek, muttered something under his breath, sending the rest into another round of laughter. Clint remained unmoved, sipping his coffee in deliberate silence. Rex's grin widened as he advanced towards Clint's booth, his heavy boots thudding against the floor. The other bikers leaned forward in their seats, watching with predatory anticipation. "I'm talking to you, old man," Rex said, stopping directly in front of Clint's table, his shadow falling across Clint. But the older man didn't look up. With exaggerated carelessness, Rex leaned against the table, nudging it just enough to tilt Clint's coffee cup. The hot liquid spilled onto the table, pooling near Clint's hand before dripping onto the floor. "Oops," Rex said mockingly, feigning innocence. "My bad. Guess you're too slow to catch it." The room was deathly silent, the laughter of Rex's cronies cut short, their faces now etched with curious anticipation. The other diners froze, their unease palpable. Even Rose stood as still as a statue, her hands gripping the edge of the counter. Clint slowly placed his coffee cup back onto the saucer, his movements precise and unhurried. He reached for a napkin and began to wipe up the spilled coffee, his focus entirely on the task at hand. His calm was unnerving, a stark contrast to Rex's loud bravado. Rex was clearly frustrated by Clint's lack of reaction. The room fell into a tense silence, the air thick with unspoken conflict. For the first time, Rex hesitated, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face, but his pride wouldn't allow him to back down. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "Then let's see what you got, old man." The stage was set, the diner's peaceful ambience now charged with impending conflict. But while Rex saw a frail old man, Clint knew better. The years may have added wrinkles to his face, but they hadn't dulled the skills he'd honed over a lifetime. The storm was coming, and Clint was ready. The atmosphere in the diner had shifted from uneasy to electrically charged. The patrons' chatter had dwindled to an uncomfortable silence. Even the hum of the air conditioner seemed muted, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Rex loomed over Clint, his smirk replaced with a hard, menacing grin. He didn't like being ignored, especially by someone he perceived as weaker. To him, Clint was just a washed-up old-timer. But Clint's steady, unwavering gaze hinted at a different reality, one Rex wasn't prepared to face. Rose, ever the peacemaker, stepped forward cautiously. "Rex, honey, let's not cause trouble here," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "You know my diner's a place for folks to eat in peace." She glanced at Clint pleadingly, as if silently asking him to let it go. But Clint wasn't one to escalate situations, and he certainly wasn't one to back down from a bully. "Don't worry, Rose," Rex said without turning around, his voice dripping with false reassurance. "I'm just having a friendly chat with this old-timer." He turned back to Clint, his grin widening. "Ain't that right, old man? We're just getting acquainted." His cronies snickered from their corner, their laughter grating against the diner's tense silence. Clint didn't reply immediately. Instead, he calmly wiped his hands with a napkin, folded it neatly, and placed it on the table. Then, with deliberate slowness, he stood up. The action seemed to unsettle Rex and his gang. There was a power in Clint's movements, a quiet confidence that belied his age. He stood slightly taller than Rex, his weathered face still unreadable, but his presence now dominated the room. "I'm not looking for trouble," Clint said, his voice low and measured, "but you seem determined to find it." The words were simple, but the way he delivered them sent a shiver through the room. It wasn't a threat. It was a statement of fact. Rex's jaw tightened. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially by someone who looked like he should be playing bingo at a retirement home. "You think you're funny?" he growled, stepping closer. "Let me tell you something, you don't scare me. I've taken down guys bigger than you without breaking a sweat." Clint tilted his head slightly, his expression neutral, but his eyes were cold and calculating. "Bigger, maybe," he replied, "but better, I doubt." The subtle jab hit its mark. Rex's face flushed crimson, and his cronies let out a chorus of mocking oohs, fanning the flames of his anger. Now he wasn't just fighting to intimidate Clint. He was fighting to save face in front of his gang. He cracked his knuckles again, this time more aggressively, as if trying to reassure himself. Rose stepped forward again, desperation in her voice. "Rex, that's enough, don't make me call the sheriff." She glanced nervously at Clint, who remained unfazed, his stance relaxed but ready. "You think the sheriff scares me?" Rex snapped over his shoulder. "This town is my playground, and I do what I want." He turned back to Clint, jabbing a finger into his chest. "And right now, I'm going to teach you a lesson you'll never forget." The other bikers began to rise from their seats, their movements slow and deliberate, their sheer number intimidating, and other patrons started to whisper to each other, some sliding towards the exits, not wanting to be present for whatever was about to happen. Rose looked around helplessly, unsure how to stop the situation from spiraling out of control. Clint finally broke his stance, taking a small step closer to Rex. Clint moved towards Rex, his movements as calm as ever. He glanced at the bikers, then back to Rex. "You don't want to do this," he said quietly, his voice carrying more of a warning than fear. "You and your boys ain't gonna like how this ends." Rex let out a scoff, though there was a hint of unease in it. "You gonna hit me with your cane or something?" He turned to his cronies. "Hey, maybe he's got a slingshot hidden in that jacket." The cronies laughed, but the sound was forced, the tension among them growing with each passing second. Clint said nothing. Instead, he took another step forward, now close enough for Rex to see the resolve in his eyes. The cronies' laughter died down as they took in Clint's expression, a look that was not only fearless but almost predatory. Rex hesitated for a fraction of a second, his instincts screaming that he was making a mistake, but Rex's pride wouldn't allow him to back down. With a growl, he clenched his fists, his muscles tensing as he prepared to strike. The room seemed to freeze, all eyes glued to the unfolding confrontation. And though Rex was the aggressor, everyone in the diner sensed the same undeniable truth. The fight wouldn't go the way he expected. Clint took a deep breath, his shoulders straightening. He'd faced men like Rex before, loud, boisterous, and overconfident, and they'd all learned the hard way that appearances could be deceiving. In the ensuing silence, Clint's voice cut through the air like a knife. "Your move, son." The diner was a tense powder keg, and the spark was about to ignite. Rex stood before Clint, his fists clenched at his sides, the veins in his arms bulging. His cronies remained seated, leaning forward, eager to witness what they believed would be an easy display of dominance. The other patrons watched with a mix of fear and morbid curiosity, no one daring to move, not even Rose, who stood as still as a statue behind the counter, her lips pressed tightly together. Rex wasted no more time. With a roar that was more bravado than genuine anger, he swung his fist towards Clint's jaw, aiming to end the confrontation with a single crushing blow. But the punch never landed. In a fluid motion, Clint swayed to the side, his movements so fast and precise that they seemed rehearsed. Rex's fist whistled past him, the momentum almost causing the larger man to topple forward. Before Rex could recover, Clint's hand shot out and clamped down on his wrist like a steel vise. The entire room gasped in unison. Clint's grip was unyielding, his fingers digging into the soft flesh of Rex's wrist with practiced precision. Rex groaned in pain as Clint twisted his arm, forcing him to stumble forward and drop to one knee. The sound of his knee hitting the tile floor echoed sharply through the diner. "First rule," Clint said calmly, his voice almost instructional, "don't telegraph your punches." Rex's face contorted in pain and humiliation as he tried to break free, but Clint's grip remained like iron. The other bikers sprang into action, their chairs scraping against the floor as they rushed towards Clint. "Let him go, old man," one of them yelled, pulling a switchblade from his pocket. The blade glinted under the flickering neon lights, sending shivers down the spines of the onlookers. Rose instinctively ducked behind the counter, her hands trembling as she fumbled for her phone. Clint remained unfazed. With a swift, deliberate motion, he released Rex's wrist and used the same hand to deliver a sharp elbow strike to his face. The blow landed with a sickening crunch, and Rex fell backward, clutching his nose as blood seeped between his fingers. Clint turned his attention to the approaching cronies, his stance relaxed but alert, like a coiled spring ready to unleash. The first one lunged at Clint with the knife, his movements clumsy and desperate. Clint easily sidestepped, grabbed his wrist, and twisted until the knife clattered to the floor. In the same motion, Clint delivered a knee strike to his gut, sending him crumpling to the ground with a groan. "Second rule," Clint said, his voice still calm, "don't bring a knife to a fistfight you don't know how to finish." The remaining bikers hesitated, their confidence shaken. The man they thought was an easy target had just taken down two of their own in a matter of seconds. But pride and adrenaline spurred them on. Two of them charged at Clint simultaneously, hoping to overwhelm him with numbers. Clint moved like a phantom, ducking under their clumsy punches and countering with a spinning kick that sent one of them crashing into a nearby table, shattering the plates and glasses atop it. The remaining biker tried to grab Clint from behind, but he was met with a swift elbow to the ribs, followed by a precise strike to the back of the knee that sent him tumbling to the floor. By now, the diner was in disarray. Tables overturned, coffee cups shattered on the floor. The other patrons had retreated to the edges of the room, watching in stunned silence as Clint dispatched the gang with the efficiency of a seasoned combatant. Rex, still clutching his bleeding nose, staggered to his feet, his face a mask of rage and disbelief. "Get him!" he roared, his voice garbled by the blood pooling in his mouth. "Take him down!" The remaining two bikers hesitated, their bravado shaken. One of them, a wiry man with serpentine tattoos winding up his neck, glanced at Rex, then back at Clint. "This ain't worth it, man," he muttered, taking a cautious step back. His companion, a hulking brute with a shaved head, also looked uncertain. "You want to get beat down like those other guys?" Clint asked, his voice steady but carrying an unmistakable edge. "Be my guest." The two men exchanged a glance. Then, as if by unspoken agreement, they turned and bolted for the door. The sound of their boots pounding against the tile floor was the only sound in the now deathly quiet diner. Rex, realizing he was outnumbered and outmatched, staggered back, his bravado evaporating. He pointed a trembling finger at Clint. "You'll regret this, old man," he spat, his voice laced with empty threats. "You don't know who you're messing with." Clint took a step forward, and Rex flinched, raising his hands defensively. "Get out," Clint said, his voice leaving no room for argument, "before you embarrass yourself any further." For a moment, it seemed like Rex would retaliate, but then he turned and stumbled towards the door, clutching his injured face. As the door slammed shut behind the bikers, the diner fell into an eerie silence. Rose cautiously emerged from behind the counter, her eyes wide with shock. "Are you all right?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Clint straightened his jacket and picked up his hat from the back of the booth. "I'm fine," he said, his tone as calm as if nothing had happened. He turned to the remaining patrons, who were staring at him in awe. "Sorry about the mess," he said simply, and with that, he walked out the door, leaving the diner and its occupants in stunned silence. The chaos in the diner reached a fever pitch as Rex staggered out the door, clutching his bloody nose and cursing into the dusty Texas air. The two bikers who had fled earlier stood by their motorcycles, watching the scene unfold inside with nervous apprehension. Clint stood tall, his calm demeanor unwavering despite the overturned tables, shattered glass, and groaning bikers sprawled across the floor. Rose, now standing behind the counter with a cordless phone clutched in her trembling hand, stared at Clint with a mixture of awe and disbelief. The other patrons, who had cowered in fear moments before, began to murmur amongst themselves, their voices laced with amazement. "Did you see that kick?" One whispered, "He moves like a man half his age." Another replied. But the temporary reprieve didn't last. Rex's pride couldn't stomach the humiliation of being defeated, especially in front of his gang and the diner's audience. Wiping blood from his face with the back of his hand, he let out a guttural growl. "Get back in there." He roared at his remaining cronies. "We ain't done with him yet." The remaining bikers hesitated for a moment, their earlier confidence completely shattered, but Rex's snarled command spurred them into action. With reluctant nods, they stormed back into the diner, 3 of them charging at Clint simultaneously. This time, they weren't looking to intimidate. They were out for revenge. Clint stood his ground, his body relaxed but ready, like a tightly coiled spring about to be released. As the first one lunged at him, Clint moved with precision, sidestepping and delivering a sharp palm strike to his chest. The man staggered back, gasping for air as he collapsed onto a table. The second one swung a heavy punch towards Clint's head, but Clint easily ducked under, his years of practice making the move seem almost instinctive. Using the momentum of his duck, Clint drove his shoulder into the man's midsection, lifting him off his feet and slamming him into a nearby booth, the impact shattering the remaining plates and glasses on the table and sending them crashing to the floor. The third biker, quicker and more tactical, aimed a kick at Clint's legs, hoping to sweep him off his feet. But Clint anticipated the move. With a fluid motion, he pivoted on one foot and countered with a spinning kick of his own, connecting squarely with the man's jaw. The biker spun sideways and crumpled to the ground, groaning in pain. Rex's face contorted in pain and humiliation as he tried to break free, but Clint's grip remained like iron. The other bikers sprang into action, their chairs scraping against the floor as they rushed towards Clint. "Let him go, old man," one of them yelled, pulling a switchblade from his pocket. The blade glinted under the flickering neon lights, sending shivers down the spines of the onlookers. Rose instinctively ducked behind the counter, her hands trembling as she fumbled for her phone. Clint remained unfazed. With a swift, deliberate motion, he released Rex's wrist and used the same hand to deliver a sharp elbow strike to his face. The blow landed with a sickening crunch, and Rex fell backward, clutching his nose as blood seeped between his fingers. Clint turned his attention to the approaching cronies, his stance relaxed but alert, like a coiled spring ready to unleash. The first one lunged at Clint with the knife, his movements clumsy and desperate. Clint easily sidestepped, grabbed his wrist, and twisted until the knife clattered to the floor. In the same motion, Clint delivered a knee strike to his gut, sending him crumpling to the ground with a groan. "Second rule," Clint said, his voice still calm, "don't bring a knife to a fistfight you don't know how to finish." The remaining bikers hesitated, their confidence shaken. The man they thought was an easy target had just taken down 2 of their own in a matter of seconds. But pride and adrenaline spurred them on. 2 of them charged at Clint simultaneously, hoping to overwhelm him with numbers. Clint moved like a phantom, ducking under their clumsy punches and countering with a spinning kick that sent one of them crashing into a nearby table, shattering the plates and glasses atop it. The remaining biker tried to grab Clint from behind, but he was met with a swift elbow to the ribs, followed by a precise strike to the back of the knee that sent him tumbling to the floor. By now, the diner was in disarray, tables overturned, coffee cups shattered on the floor. The other patrons had retreated to the edges of the room, watching in stunned silence as Clint dispatched the gang with the efficiency of a seasoned combatant. Rex, still clutching his bleeding nose, staggered to his feet, his face a mask of rage and disbelief. "Get him!" he roared, his voice garbled by the blood pooling in his mouth. "Take him down!" The remaining 2 bikers hesitated, their bravado shaken. One of them, a wiry man with serpentine tattoos winding up his neck, glanced at Rex, then back at Clint. "This ain't worth it, man," he muttered, taking a cautious step back. His companion, a hulking brute with a shaved head, also looked uncertain. "You want to get beat down like those other guys?" Clint asked, his voice steady but carrying an unmistakable edge. "Be my guest." The two men exchanged a glance. Then, as if by unspoken agreement, they turned and bolted for the door. The sound of their boots pounding against the tile floor was the only sound in the now deathly quiet diner. Rex, realizing he was outnumbered and outmatched, staggered back, his bravado evaporating. He pointed a trembling finger at Clint. "You'll regret this, old man," he spat, his voice laced with empty threats. "You don't know who you're messing with." Clint took a step forward, and Rex flinched, raising his hands defensively. "Get out," Clint said, his voice leaving no room for argument, "before you embarrass yourself any further." For a moment, it seemed like Rex would retaliate, but then he turned and stumbled towards the door, clutching his injured face. As the door slammed shut behind the bikers, the diner fell into an eerie silence. Rose cautiously emerged from behind the counter, her eyes wide with shock. "Are you all right?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Clint straightened his jacket and picked up his hat from the back of the booth. "I'm fine," he said, his tone as calm as if nothing had happened. He turned to the remaining patrons, who were staring at him in awe. "Sorry about the mess," he said simply, and with that, he walked out the door, leaving the diner and its occupants in stunned silence. The chaos in the diner reached a fever pitch as Rex staggered out the door, clutching his bloody nose and cursing into the dusty Texas air. The two bikers who had fled earlier stood by their motorcycles, watching the scene unfold inside with nervous apprehension. Clint stood tall, his calm demeanor unwavering despite the overturned tables, shattered glass, and groaning bikers sprawled across the floor. Rose, now standing behind the counter with a cordless phone clutched in her trembling hand, stared at Clint with a mixture of awe and disbelief. The other patrons, who had cowered in fear moments before, began to murmur amongst themselves, their voices laced with amazement. "Did you see that kick?" One whispered, "He moves like a man half his age," another replied. But the temporary reprieve didn't last. Rex's pride couldn't stomach the humiliation of being defeated, especially in front of his gang and the diner's audience. Wiping blood from his face with the back of his hand, he let out a guttural growl. "Get back in there," he roared at his remaining cronies. "We ain't done with him yet." The remaining bikers hesitated for a moment, their earlier confidence completely shattered, but Rex's snarled command spurred them into action. With reluctant nods, they stormed back into the diner, three of them charging at Clint simultaneously. This time, they weren't looking to intimidate. They were out for revenge. Clint stood his ground, his body relaxed but ready, like a tightly coiled spring about to be released. As the first one lunged at him, Clint moved with precision, sidestepping and delivering a sharp palm strike to his chest. The man staggered back, gasping for air as he collapsed onto a table. The second one swung a heavy punch towards Clint's head, but Clint easily ducked under, his years of practice making the move seem almost instinctive. Using the momentum of his duck, Clint drove his shoulder into the man's midsection, lifting him off his feet and slamming him into a nearby booth, the impact shattering the remaining plates and glasses on the table and sending them crashing to the floor. The third biker, quicker and more tactical, aimed a kick at Clint's legs, hoping to sweep him off his feet. But Clint anticipated the move. With a fluid motion, he pivoted on one foot and countered with a spinning kick of his own, connecting squarely with the man's jaw. The biker spun sideways and crumpled to the ground, groaning in pain. The diner erupted with gasps and cheers from the onlookers who had stayed. Their fear had given way to awe at Clint's skill. "He's like some kind of action hero," one man exclaimed, his voice filled with disbelief. Rose, still clutching the phone, shook her head in amazement. "I don't know who he is, but he sure ain't just some retiree," she muttered to herself. At this point, only one biker remained standing. He was younger than the others, wiry and jittery, with a nervous energy that made him unpredictable. He pulled a chain from his pocket, the heavy links clinking as he swung it menacingly. "You ain't walking out of here without some bruises, old man," he snarled. Clint didn't reply. He simply shifted his stance, his hands raised in a defensive posture. The biker swung the chain, aiming for Clint's torso, but Clint easily sidestepped. Before the biker could recover, Clint closed the distance between them and caught the chain mid-swing. With a swift motion, Clint wrapped the chain around the biker's wrist and pulled him forward, slamming his face into the counter. The biker crumpled to the ground, dazed and defeated. Outside, Rex paced back and forth in a rage, his anger growing with each passing second. He couldn't believe what he was hearing from inside, the groans of his downed cronies, the sounds of them hitting furniture, the gasps and cheers of the onlookers. Grabbing a crowbar from his motorcycle, Rex stormed back into the diner, his face contorted with fury. "You think you've won?" Rex screamed, brandishing the crowbar. "I'll show you what happens when you mess with me." Clint turned to face him, his expression as calm and unwavering as ever. He straightened his jacket and stepped forward, the soft thud of his boots the only sound in the room. "This is your last chance to walk away," Clint said, his voice steady and even. "Don't make me hurt you any more than I have to." Rex let out a furious roar and charged at Clint, swinging the crowbar wildly. Clint dodged the first swing, then the second, his movements fluid and effortless. On the third swing, Clint caught Rex's wrist mid-arc and twisted sharply, forcing Rex to drop the crowbar with a cry of pain. With a swift kick, Clint sent the crowbar skittering across the room, leaving Rex unarmed and defenseless. He released Rex's wrist and shoved him hard in the chest, sending him staggering backward into a booth. Gasping for breath and clutching his arm, Rex looked up at Clint with a mixture of fear and awe. The fight was over. Clint stood tall, his breathing steady, while Rex and his gang lay scattered across the diner, defeated and humiliated. The onlookers erupted in applause, their cheers filling the small space. Rose emerged from behind the counter, her face a mixture of relief and gratitude. Clint adjusted his hat and turned towards the door, his steps slow and deliberate. "Next time," he said over his shoulder, his voice carrying a gentle warning, "think twice before picking a fight you can't finish." With that, Clint walked out of the diner, leaving behind a room full of stunned patrons and a defeated biker gang who would think twice before crossing him, or anyone like him, again. The sun hung low in the Texas sky, casting long shadows across the dusty parking lot outside the diner. The bikers sat dejectedly by their motorcycles, nursing their wounds in sullen silence. Rex, his face bloody and swollen, leaned against his bike, staring at the diner door as if Clint might reappear at any moment. His bruised ego ached more than the throbbing in his nose. For the first time in years, he'd been humiliated, and he wasn't sure how to handle it. Inside the diner, the tension was finally beginning to dissipate. Tables were righted, chairs were rearranged, and shattered glass was swept into a dustpan by a few eager patrons trying to restore order. Rose, still shaken, poured herself a strong cup of coffee before stepping out from behind the counter. "I don't know who that man was," she muttered, shaking her head, "but he sure knew how to handle himself." A burly truck driver sitting at the end of the counter nodded in agreement. "He moved like those martial arts guys in the movies," he said, his voice laced with admiration. "Didn't even break a sweat." The other patrons murmured in agreement, some of them replaying Clint's moves in their heads like a scene from an action flick. The atmosphere in the diner had shifted from fear to a kind of awed respect for the mysterious stranger who had walked in and turned everything upside down. Meanwhile, Rose couldn't stop thinking about Clint. She'd served thousands of customers in her years of running the diner, but none had left an impression quite like him. The way he moved, the calm way he spoke, everything about him was extraordinary, especially for a man his age. Most men his age complained about aching knees and sore backs, but Clint had just taken down a rowdy biker gang with the precision of a trained warrior. Outside in the parking lot, Rex paced back and forth in a fury, his boots kicking up small clouds of dust. "We can't let this slide," he growled, his voice filled with frustration. One of his men, still clutching his bruised ribs, looked at him with apprehension. "What do you want to do, Rex? Go back in there and get your ass kicked again? That guy ain't normal." Rex spun around, his face flushed with anger. "We can't let some old man make fools." of us. Do you know what people will say when they hear about this? We're the Iron Serpents. Damn it. We can't let anyone make us look weak. But even as he shouted, there was a hint of doubt in his voice. Deep down, Rex knew his man was right. Clint wasn't just some old-timer. They'd underestimated him, and they'd paid the price. The youngest member of the gang, a wiry guy named Dusty, finally spoke up. Maybe we should just leave him be, Rex. I mean, look what he did to us. Do you think he's some kind of retired vet or something? Dusty's voice trailed off, but his words struck a chord with the rest of the gang. What kind of man could take down 5 bikers without breaking a sweat? Rex glared at Dusty, but his anger no longer carried the same weight. He was too preoccupied with his bruised ego and the nagging feeling that Dusty might be right. Whoever he is, Rex muttered, his voice low, he ain't getting away with this. We'll find a way. Next time we'll be ready. Inside the diner, Rose decided to step outside for some fresh air. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. She leaned against the doorframe, her thoughts still lingering on Clint. A few minutes later, she was surprised to see him walking along the side of the highway, his figure silhouetted against the setting sun. Without hesitation, Rose grabbed a to-go cup of coffee and hurried after him. Hey, she called. Clint slowed his pace and turned to face her, his expression as calm as ever. Thought you might need this, she said, handing him the coffee. You didn't finish your cup back there. Anyway. Clint accepted the coffee with an appreciative nod. Thanks, he said simply, taking a sip. Rose hesitated, unsure how to broach the subject that had been haunting her since the fight. I don't mean to pry, she began, but who are you? You're not just some retiree passing through, are you? Clint regarded her for a moment, his sharp eyes studying her face. Just a man who's lived long enough to know trouble when he sees it, he said. His words carried a weight, a hint of untold stories. Rose wanted to ask more, but something in his tone told her he wouldn't share more than he wanted to. Well, whoever you are, she said, thank you. Those guys have been causing trouble around here for years. I've never seen anyone stand up to them like that. Clint gave a faint smile, tilting his hat. Sometimes, people like that need to be reminded they're not as tough as they think. As Clint turned to leave, Rose called out one last time. Be careful on your way, sir. I don't think Rex is the kind to let this go. Clint paused for a moment, his back to her, before replying. Let him come, he said quietly, his voice carrying a note of finality. And with that, he continued down the highway, his long shadow stretching across the dusty road in the fading light. Rose watched him go, a strange mix of admiration and apprehension lingering in her heart. Whoever Clint Eastwood was, she knew one thing for sure. He was not a man to be underestimated. Night had fallen on the small Texas town. The sky was a deep indigo, sprinkled with stars. The once bustling diner was now eerily quiet. The only sounds the hum of the neon sign outside and the occasional chirping of a cicada. Inside, Rose finished locking up, the day's events still replaying in her mind as she wiped down the counter one last time. The image of Clint calmly taking down Rex and his gang played out like a scene from a movie. She felt a mix of awe and unease. Rex wasn't the kind of man to let a defeat like this go unchallenged. Meanwhile, on the outskirts of town, in a dilapidated garage that served as the Iron Serpent's base, Rex paced like a caged animal. His gang sat slumped on greasy benches, their bruised faces illuminated by the harsh overhead lights. The tension in the room was palpable, no one daring to speak as Rex muttered curses under his breath, slamming a wrench against a workbench to punctuate his frustration. Do you know how this makes us look? Rex growled, turning to glare at his men. That old man humiliated us. People are gonna think we're weak. His voice trembled with rage, and his swollen nose only made his words sound more distorted. The gang exchanged nervous glances. Dusty, the youngest and least experienced of the group, finally gathered the courage to speak up. Rex, maybe we should just let this go. That guy ain't normal. You saw what he did to us. If we... Rex interrupted. Dusty, run, hide? Is that what you want to say? He leaned in close, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. We're the Iron Serpents. We don't let anyone make us look like fools. No one. Dusty looked away, his cheeks flushed with embarrassment. He wasn't the only one who doubted the wisdom of going after Clint again, but no one else dared to voice their concerns. Rex wasn't just their leader, he was their enforcer, and crossing him was almost as dangerous as facing Clint. Rex slammed his fist against the workbench again. Sending a toolbox crashing to the floor will find him, he declared, his voice laced with cold determination. And this time we won't hold back. He wants to play the hero, fine. Let's see how tough he is when we come at him with everything we've got. The gang didn't cheer or applaud. They simply nodded grimly. They knew better than to argue, even if they doubted the plan. Rex began assigning tasks, ordering them to gather weapons and gear. No more games, he said, this time we finish it. Across town, Clint had settled into a small, nondescript motel on the edge of the highway. The room was Spartan but clean, with a bed, a table, and a flickering TV mounted on the wall. Clint sat at the table, a cup of coffee in one hand and a worn leather notebook in the other. He wasn't writing. He was reading, flipping through pages filled with sketches, notes, and photographs. Some were faded and yellowed with age, others were more recent but still bore the marks of time. The notebook was a reminder of the life he'd lived, the battles he'd fought, the people he'd met, the lessons he'd learned. It was a catalog of wisdom earned through decades of hardship and experience, and though Clint rarely allowed himself to dwell on the past, tonight he found himself lingering on a particular page, a photograph of himself in his 30s, standing alongside a group of men in karate uniforms. The younger version of himself looked sharp, focused, and powerful, but the fire in his eyes was the same fire that burned in him now. As he sipped his coffee, Clint's thoughts drifted to the diner. He knew men like Rex, men who mistook bluster for strength, who believed that power came from intimidation. They were dangerous not for their skill, but for their pride, and men like Rex never walked away quietly. Clint knew the fight wasn't over. It was just a matter of time before they came looking for him. Back at the diner, Rose stood outside, the building's keys jingling in her hand as she locked up. The night air was cool, but a sense of unease lingered in her stomach. She glanced down the empty road, half expecting to see Rex's gang return. She'd seen their kind before, bullies who thrived on fear and wouldn't rest until they regained control. And now, with Clint gone, she felt exposed. Rose sighed and turned to head home, when the distant roar of motorcycle engines cut through the night. Her heart sank. The sound grew louder, closer, until headlights appeared on the horizon. She recognized the sound instantly. It was the Iron Serpents. Within minutes, the gang had pulled into the diner's parking lot, their bikes roaring as they idled. Rex dismounted first, his movements stiff but purposeful. His face was still swollen from his earlier encounter with Clint, but his eyes burned with anger. "He's not here," Rose said firmly, stepping forward before they could reach the diner. "You're too late." Rex sneered at her, his lips curling in a way that made her stomach churn. "Where is he?" he asked, his voice sharp and menacing. Rose met his gaze, trying to hide her fear. "He's gone. I don't know where he went. And even if I did, I wouldn't tell you." Rex stepped closer, his shadow looming over her. "You better not be lying, Rose. That old man has a debt to pay, and I'm gonna collect. Just go, Rex, you've done enough damage for one day." Rose stood her ground. Rex stared at her for a moment before letting out a bitter laugh. "Fine," he said, turning back to his bike. "But this ain't over." He climbed onto his motorcycle and revved the engine, signaling for his gang to follow. As they roared off into the night, Rose felt a mix of relief and dread. She didn't know where Clint had gone, but she prayed he was ready for what was coming. And somewhere down the highway, Clint was preparing, too. He knew the Iron Serpents wouldn't let this go, and he was ready to teach them a final lesson they'd never forget. Clint sat in the dimly lit motel room, the soft whir of the ceiling fan overhead the only sound in the quiet night. His leather notebook lay open on the table before him, a small lamp casting light on the aged pages. He turned the photographs and notes with a slow, deliberate hand, Each page turned, pulling him deeper into the memories of a life that had shaped him into the man he was today. The photograph of his younger self in the karate uniform caught his eye again. His face youthful but stern, his eyes sharp and determined. He remembered that day vividly. It was the day he had earned his black belt after years of grueling training. The image stirred a wave of nostalgia, but it also carried a clarity about the lessons learned from discipline, failure, and perseverance. Decades ago, Clint had been a young man with something to prove. Growing up in a rough neighborhood on the outskirts of Los Angeles, he had witnessed firsthand the kind of violence and cruelty that men like Rex thrived on. He saw bullies prey on the weak, and he vowed early on never to be a victim. It was a vow that led him to a small karate dojo tucked between a laundromat and a fast food joint, a place where he would find not only strength but purpose. The dojo's master, a stern but compassionate man named Mr. Harrison, took Clint under his wing. Mr. Harrison saw potential in the wiry, determined teenager who showed up every day, rain or shine, eager to learn. But Mr. Harrison's lessons weren't just about punches and kicks. He taught Clint the philosophy of martial arts, the importance of control, discipline, and respect. Strength isn't about who can hit the hardest, Mr. Harrison had told him one evening after a particularly grueling sparring session. It's about knowing when not to hit at all. A true warrior only fights when there is no other choice. Those words had stayed with Clint throughout his life, guiding him through countless trials. He carried those lessons with him into the military, where his combat training and martial arts expertise served him well in high-stakes situations, and later, as a civilian, those same principles helped him navigate a world that often tested his patience and resolve. Testing his patience and resolve. Clint closed the notebook, leaning back in the creaky chair as he let the memories wash over him. He wasn't a man who sought out trouble, but trouble had a way of finding him. He thought of Rex and the Iron Serpents, their arrogance and misplaced confidence. Men like them didn't understand strength. They only understood power, and when their power was challenged, they reacted with violence. But Clint had faced worse. He had stood on battlefields, fought against odds that would have broken lesser men. He knew how to stay calm under pressure, how to turn fear into focus. The fight in the diner wasn't the first time he'd been outnumbered, and it probably wouldn't be the last. But he also knew something the Iron Serpents didn't. The fight wasn't over when the fists stopped flying. It was over when the lesson was learned. As the hours ticked by, Clint prepared for what he knew was inevitable. He practiced breathing exercises, steadying his mind and body. He stretched, working out the kinks in his muscles, and reviewed the techniques he had honed over decades of practice. Each movement was deliberate, each breath a reminder of the discipline that had carried him through a lifetime of challenges. Meanwhile, Rex and his gang were preparing for their revenge. Back at the garage, they loaded up their saddlebags with weapons. Chains, baseball bats, and knives. Rex's face was a mask of determination, the swelling around his nose doing nothing to dim the fire in his eyes. "This time, we don't hold back," he growled at his men. "I don't care how tough that old man thinks he is. We're going to show him what happens when you mess with the Iron Serpents." But not all his men shared his confidence. Dusty, the youngest member of the gang, lingered near the back of the room, his expression uneasy. "Rex," he said hesitantly, "what if he's some kind of ex-military guy? He ain't just some random old man. He knows what he's doing." Rex shot him a cold glare. "I don't care if he's Rambo," he snapped. "He ain't invincible. He just got lucky. And tonight we're going to show him his place." As the gang revved their engines and prepared to ride out, Dusty couldn't shake the feeling that they were making a mistake, but he knew better than to challenge Rex. He climbed onto his motorcycle with a heavy heart, following the others as they roared off into the night. Back in the motel room, Clint stood by the window, gazing out into the darkness. The faint sound of distant motorcycle engines confirmed what he already knew. They were coming. He took a deep breath, his expression calm but resolute. He'd faced men like Rex before, and he knew how to handle them. Clint reached for his jacket, slipping it on with practiced ease as he stepped out into the cool night air. The stars overhead seemed a little brighter. He wasn't looking for a fight, but if the Iron Serpents brought it to his doorstep, he was ready to finish what they'd started. In the stillness of the night, Clint's training, experience, and determination coalesced into one thought. This was the moment Rex and his gang would learn the difference between bravado and true strength. The distant roar of motorcycle engines grew louder, cutting through the stillness of the Texas night. Clint stood outside the dimly lit motel, his figure silhouetted against the flickering vacancy sign above. The faint scent of desert sage drifted on the cool breeze, mingling with the tension in the air. Clint's expression was calm, his posture relaxed, but his eyes scanned the horizon with the precision of a predator. He had been waiting for this moment. The Iron Serpent's convoy roared into view, their headlights piercing the darkness. One by one, they pulled into the gravel parking lot, their engines rumbling like a storm. Rex was the first to dismount, his bruised face twisted in a snarl. Behind him, his gang followed, their numbers bolstered by a few extra bikers who hadn't been at the diner earlier. They were armed with chains, baseball bats, and knives, their weapons glinting in the pale moonlight. "Good evening, boys," Clint said, his voice calm, but carrying an unmistakable edge. He leaned casually against a wooden post, his hands resting loosely at his sides. "Didn't expect to see you again so soon." Rex stepped forward, his boots crunching on the gravel. "Cut the crap, old man," he growled. "You humiliated us back there, and now it's time to pay. You're gonna regret messing with the Iron Serpents." Clint tilted his head slightly, his lips curling into a faint smile. "Really?" he said, his voice almost amused. "You think bringing a few more friends is gonna change the outcome?" Rex's face darkened, his grip tightening on the crowbar. "Oh, it'll end all right, and this time you ain't walking away." The gang spread out, surrounding Clint in a loose circle. Their movements were coordinated but cautious, each of them keeping a close eye on Clint's every move. They'd underestimated him once, and they wouldn't make the same mistake twice. But even with their newfound caution, there was an undercurrent of fear in their eyes. They'd seen what he was capable of, and a part of them wondered if they were in over their heads. Clint straightened up, brushing dust off his jacket as he took a step forward. "You boys have one last chance to walk away," he said, his voice steady and unwavering. "You don't want to do this." Rex let out a bitter laugh. "You ain't calling the shots here, old man. Take him down," he roared, signaling his gang. The first one lunged forward, a chain swinging in a wide arc towards Clint's head. Clint ducked easily, the chain whistling harmlessly through the air. In the same motion, he grabbed the man's arm, twisted it behind his back, and delivered a sharp strike to his ribs. The man groaned in pain as he crumpled to the ground, clutching his side. Another biker charged at Clint with a knife, slashing wildly. Clint sidestepped, his movements quick and calculated. He caught the man's wrist and delivered a sharp elbow strike to his forearm, forcing him to drop the blade. Before the man could react, Clint swept his leg, sending him sprawling onto the gravel. The remaining bikers hesitated, their earlier confidence faltering as they watched their comrades fall one by one. But Rex's furious roar spurred them on. "What are you waiting for? Get him!" he yelled, his voice laced with desperation. Two of them charged at once, one swinging a baseball bat, the other aiming a kick at Clint's legs. Clint moved like a phantom, dodging their attacks with uncanny precision. He delivered a spinning kick that sent the bat flying, then followed up with a powerful punch to the other man's jaw. Both men hit the ground, groaning in pain. Rex's face contorted with rage as he watched his gang fall apart. Gripping the crowbar tightly, he charged at Clint, swinging with all his might. Clint caught the movement out of the corner of his eye and sidestepped at the last moment. The crowbar whistled past him by a hair's breadth as Rex stumbled forward. Clint delivered a swift strike to his wrist, forcing him to drop the weapon. Rex howled in pain but refused to back down. He swung his fists wildly, but his movements were clumsy and fueled by rage. Clint easily blocked each blow, his years of training allowing him to anticipate every move. Finally, Clint delivered a precise palm strike to Rex's chest, sending him staggering backward and crashing to the ground. The remaining bikers froze, their weapons dangling at their sides. They looked at Clint, then at Rex, and finally at each other. It was clear the fight was over. Clint stood in the center of the circle, his breathing steady, his posture unwavering. Rex struggled to his feet, his pride wounded more deeply than his body. He glared at Clint, his eyes burning with a mixture of hatred and defeat. "You think this is over?" he spat, his voice hoarse. "You think you've won?" Clint took a step forward, his gaze sharp. "It's over when you decide it's over," he said. "Walk away, learn something from this, or come back and lose again. It's your choice." For a long moment, Rex stared at Clint, his jaw clenched. Finally, he turned to his gang and growled, "Let's go." One by one, the bikers climbed onto their motorcycles, their faces etched with defeat. The roar of their engines faded into the night as they disappeared down the highway. Clint watched them go, his expression unreadable. He adjusted his jacket and turned back towards the motel, the crunch of gravel beneath his boots the only sound in the quiet night. Behind him, the parking lot lay littered with discarded weapons and the echoes of a fight that had left its mark on all involved. The battle was over, but Clint knew the lessons would linger for Rex and his gang. It was a stark reminder that strength wasn't about numbers or weapons, but about discipline, skill, and the quiet confidence of a man who had nothing to prove. For Clint, it was just another chapter in a life defined by battles fought and lessons taught. As he stepped back into the glow of the motel's neon sign, Clint felt no sense of victory, only the steady calm of a man who had done what needed to be done. The night was quiet again, and Clint was ready to move on, leaving behind a group of men who would never forget the day they crossed his path. The early morning sun painted the Texas landscape in soft hues of gold and amber, casting long shadows over the now quiet town. On the edge of the motel parking lot, Clint leaned against a wooden post, sipping the last of his coffee. The events of the previous night had already faded into the background of his mind, another page in the well-worn notebook of his life. For Clint, it wasn't about the fight itself, but about the lesson. Down the highway, the iron serpents gathered at their garage, battered and bruised, but unusually quiet. Rex sat slumped on a chair, an ice pack pressed against his swollen face. The fire in his eyes had dimmed, replaced by something far more unfamiliar: doubt. His men lingered, nearby, nursing their own wounds and exchanging cautious glances. The bravado that had once defined them was conspicuously absent. Dusty, the youngest of the group, finally broke the silence. "Rex," he began hesitantly, his voice laced with uncertainty. "What do we do now?" The question hung in the air, heavier than any of them had anticipated. Rex stared at the floor, his jaw clenched as he wrestled with the answer. For the first time, Rex wasn't sure. He'd built his reputation and his gang on intimidation and dominance, but Clint had shattered that illusion in a single night. The man hadn't just beaten them physically. He'd broken their confidence, exposing the hollowness of their power. "We let it go," Rex finally muttered, the words tasting bitter in his mouth. "What?" one of the older bikers exclaimed, his disbelief evident. "We just let him walk after what he did to us?" Rex shot him a sharp glare. "Didn't you see his eyes?" He growled, "That man's seen more than we can imagine. He could have done a lot worse to us if he wanted to. We're lucky he didn't." The room fell silent again as the truth of Rex's words sank in. Even the most hot-headed among them couldn't deny it. Clint had shown restraint, and they didn't know how much worse things could have been. Back at the diner, Rose unlocked the door to start her morning shift. The place was still recovering from the previous day's chaos, but the sight of sunlight streaming through the windows made it seem less daunting. As she started brewing the first pot of coffee, she noticed a folded piece of paper on the counter. Frowning, she unfolded it and immediately recognized Clint's precise, deliberate handwriting. "Thanks for the coffee and for holding your ground. Keep that courage." Rose smiled, the tension in her shoulders easing. She tucked the note into her apron pocket, feeling a newfound sense of peace. Clint's presence had been fleeting, but it had left a lasting impression, not just on her, but on the entire town. By midday, the story of the fight had spread like wildfire. Truckers passing through the diner shared exaggerated tales of Clint's moves, each retelling more dramatic than the last. Some claimed he was military trained, others swore he was a retired martial arts master. For Rose, the truth didn't matter. What mattered was how Clint had carried himself, with integrity, strength, and a quiet wisdom that was rare in the world. A regular customer, a local rancher, leaned against the counter and shook his head in admiration. "I hope that fella comes back someday," he said to Rose. "We could use more men like him around here." Rose nodded in agreement, though she doubted Clint would return. He didn't strike her as the kind of man to stay in one place for long. Further down the road, Clint walked along the highway's edge, his steps steady and unhurried. The weight of his years rested comfortably on his shoulders, not as a burden, but as a reminder of the life he'd lived. The morning sun warmed his face, and the distant hum of a truck engine was the only sound in the vast stillness around him. As he walked, Clint thought of Rex and his gang. He hadn't fought them to prove a point or to defend his ego. He'd fought them to remind them, and perhaps himself, of a simple truth. Strength without wisdom is dangerous, and true strength lies in knowing when to use it. Whether they'd learned that lesson, Clint didn't know, but he hoped they had. Clint paused by a roadside marker, his gaze sweeping across the vast expanse of the desert. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the notebook, flipping to a blank page. With a pencil worn down to a nub, he wrote a single line. "Sometimes the strongest stance is the silent one." He closed the notebook and slipped it back into his pocket before continuing down the road. Hours later, Rex sat alone in the garage, his men having dispersed to lick their wounds and ponder. The crowbar he had brandished the night before lay on the floor, forgotten and irrelevant. Rex stared at it, a symbol of his supposed power, and felt a pang of shame as he questioned, for the first time, the path he had chosen and the man he had become. In the stillness of that moment, Rex realized that Clint hadn't just defeated him, he had given him a choice. Rex could cling to the fragile power he had built, or he could take a hard look at himself and change. It was a humbling realization, but it carried a glimmer of hope. When the sun dipped below the horizon, Clint had vanished, a solitary figure fading into the vastness of the Texas plains. The town settled back into its quiet rhythm, but the memory of the mysterious man who had walked into the diner and turned everything upside down lingered like a ripple on a still pond. Clint Eastwood wasn't a hero, at least not in the way most people imagined. He was a man who had lived, learned, and fought, not for glory, but for the principles that defined him. And as the stars began to dot the night sky, one thing was clear. Wherever Clint went next, he would carry those principles with him, leaving behind not just memories, but lessons. When faced with a bully, would you keep calm or choose to fight back? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your story might inspire others. This story reminds us that sometimes, calmness and experience can defeat arrogance and violence. Have you ever encountered a similar situation? If you found this story interesting and meaningful, don't hesitate to share it with friends and family to spread the message of true strength, not from muscles, but from self-confidence and control. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to not miss the next exciting stories. Have a wonderful day. Thank you for supporting the channel. Please like, share, and subscribe to receive the latest updates. The stories are collected from various sources and do not represent any individual or organization. They are shared for the purpose of spreading humane values in life and have been rewritten with the assistance of AI. If there are any errors, please overlook them with understanding. Wishing you all the best in life.